Okay, we're gonna start now. I'm sure more people will roll in as the time goes. So today we're gonna be looking at the digestive system. So this involves what you eat and how it goes through your body and how you eventually digest it and absorb the nutrients. And this is a very important process as it's what all living things need to do, apart from plants. Obviously, they need to, any consumer so a consumer, we'll get to what like consumer producer means, but a consumer is something that needs to consume other excess organisms or food sources like plants to gain their food, but a producer is a organism that can produce its own food. So today we're going to be looking at what the digestive system is and how that works. Uh, Give me a sec. I can turn my camera on. Yeah. Okay, so the digestive system. So every day we eat a bunch of things like carrots, meat, hamburgers, salads, noodles, whatever it may be. And the whole point we're eating these things is to absorb the nutrients or the things that we need from these foods to survive, right? And so this is essentially the job of your digestive system. So starts in the mouth, runs through your body, and then gets expelled, right? And so the whole point of the system is to absorb the nutrients. And so you can use those nutrients and use those molecules to do other things. Like, for example, when we learned about proteins, we learned how amino acids were the building blocks of these proteins. And so, where do we get these proteins from, right? Well, they come from meat, right? They come from meat or egg or other sources. And you essentially absorb the nutrients from those foods, and then your body uses energy to break down the larger molecules into those smaller molecules, also known as those amino acids. And then your body can then build them up to the proper amino acids that it needs. So some key points here is that many molecules your body can actually produce from yourself. So it doesn't specifically need the nutrients from each individual food. So when we talked about chemistry, the basic unit of life is still the atom, right? So technically the body can still break apart any type of molecule until it reaches the atom state or the or as small as an atom, and then it can just build it back up. And so there's some amino acids that the body can make by itself just using the building blocks of like atoms, etc. I think there's also some amino acids which are called essential amino acids, or in the form of minerals like essential minerals. And so these are molecules that your body cannot produce and need to obtain from other food sources. So I'll actually like to go a bit over the evolution of the digestive system. This I'll go over for two reasons. Reason one, because it is pretty interesting to learn about. Number two, it's also I want you guys to get kind of appreciate how evolution works and how species have evolved over time. As in the next after next class in the next month, we'll actually be talking about what evolution is and how that is the central theme of all biology. You guys have evolution, natural selection, etc. And so I just want to get you into thinking about it at least a little. So chapter one was the early beginning. So this was pre-Cambrian and early Metazoans. All these terms will become more clear when we actually talk about like the geological time scale of life and what like each individual event meant. But if you remember from our very first class, I think we touched upon what the Cambrian explosion was. This was a time about 300 million years ago that a bunch of species evolved. So this was actually before that. And so in this area of time, there were simple organisms, right? And they were called the protozoa. And how they absorb nutrients is very different from us. Because they were only single cell, like here, and they're very thin, they could just essentially absorb nutrients through their environment, through simple diffusion, right? And so their internal state is technically the same as the external state. So they only absorb nutrients via diffusion, simple diffusion. Only when the outside gradient is more concentrated will materials flow into the cell. And the cell doesn't need that much material as it's, remember, this is a single cell organism, so it's one singular cell. And so during this time, we also did have early multicellular organisms. So these were organisms that had multi-cells or had multiple cells, such as sponges, which we'll look about late in the next slide. They lacked a true digestive system. However, they actually did have like specialized cells for not really digestion. We call it absorption, nutrient absorption. So during this time, there were multicellular organisms that were a bit more complex. And so here we have our sponges. And another interesting about the sponges, we'll learn about like how animals evolved and like the tree of life of animals. Like we looked at the tree of life for plants, we also look at the tree of life for animals. But sponges were actually considered the first animals because they had this sort of nice specialization. And so essentially how sponges absorb the nutrients was they have this sort of like mouth opening. So this would be a sponge. And then they have these special cells over here. And these cells, if you zoom in, kind of look like this. Essentially how this works is there's these phloem, remember that, it's like the moving part. And then there's a bunch of these cilia and they come together. It's called a collar. And these are constantly powered by ATP to spin and rotate. And this creates a driving force of food that goes into the cell. As you can see, it goes into the cell and it collects as these tiny particles. And these cells then meet with an amoebocyte, which is just something over here, and then that donates the nutrients to the rest of the body. And so this is like a sort of one of the first kind of digestive systems, you could call it. And essentially, I just explained how it worked, but as you can see, it's not really true digestive system. It's just each individual cell is kind of performing their own sort of nutrient absorption. And so chapter 2, the rise of early gastrovascular cavity and early metazoans. So the gastrovascular cavity is a sort of cavity that develops during birth and during animal development, like we talked about earlier in previous classes about animal development. And essentially, the gastrovascular cavity is this sort of cavity that allows food to come in. So it's like your mouth essentially. And so the development of this cavity marked a very major evolutionary step. Early animals like the cynardians, so e.g., like the jellyfish and corals, developed this cavity, and it's allowed digestion to occur. The nutrients were absorbed through the body walls, and waste was expelled through the same opening. So nutrients would come to here. These cells lining this place would absorb it, and then they would release it. And so Medusa, the jellyfishes, and polyps, which are a form of coral, these are what we call the chapter 2 organisms. And polyps are stationary filter feeders. So we have this basal disc that sticks to a surface like coral. So they kind of sit there and sort of similar to the sponges, but a bit more complex. And then the medusa is actually we have like jellyfish can move, right? So these medusa can move around, and then they use these tentacles to attack the prey, and then the prey comes into the mouth, and then it gets digested and absorbed through here. Chapter 3, development of a one-way digestive tract. So we talked about how the digestive tract kind of comes in this cavity and gets kind of absorbed and all that. Well, now we really get to the development of what we call one-way digestive tract. And this was first involving bilaterians, which, if you remember, we talked about bilaterians are organisms that have a one-way symmetry. So, like for example, this shape, like in this picture, we can see this is a flatworm, and you can see it has bilateral symmetry. We humans are bilateral symmetry. Your cats, your dogs, your elephants, your mouses, your ants, whatever, all are bilateral symmetry. And so this is where the bilateral symmetry is where really this one-way digestive tract formed. Essentially, evolved the digestive system with a mouth and an anus, which is where the waste is expelled. So it doesn't like come in the mouth, come out. It's like one way if you think about it correctly. And so this development was crucial for the evolution of more complex organisms as they required more, as they required a higher demand of nutrients. Because as organisms become more complex, they require more nutrients to grow, etc. And so chapter 4, the evolution of specialized digestive organs. So remember that one-way track? Well, that one-way track before was literally just a one-way track. It was just a track. It'd come in, the food would come in, and just get absorbed. But now in chapter 4, we get to animals developing specialized parts of the digestive system. Like us, we have like our stomach, small intestine, large intestine, mouth, etc. These insects, for example, this grasshopper, also had developed these specialized kind of chambers, you could say. And so next we'll finally get to the human digestive system. So what the human digestive system contains is the mouth, then moving on to the esophagus, then the stomach, then the small intestine, and then the small intestine is like kind of in partner with the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. Here's the liver. Oh yeah, here's the mouth. Here's the esophagus. Here's the liver, gallbladder, pancreas. So these three release enzymes, which we'll talk about what they do later and how it's related. And then this is the stomach, and then we'll move on to the large intestine, which is over. So the small intestine is this little part inside, the large intestine is the thing around it, and then it goes to the rectum, and then it gets expelled. So we'll start off with the mouth and something called saliva. So I'm sure you guys know what saliva is, but if you didn't know, saliva comes out these two glands. So the first gland is underneath your tongue, and the second gland is up, like up and near the back of your throat, on the top of the back of your throat over here. And so what saliva does is saliva actually helps kind of break down the food a bit at the start. It's not very effective, but what it really wants to do is it kind of moistens the food and then turns into what we call a bolus, which is kind of like a ball of food, and that can slide down your esophagus. And your tongue, obviously, your tongue helps you like shape it into a bolus and move the food around. Your tooth help you chew, and food obviously enters through your mouth. This is the first step. So the second step is what we call the division of pathways. And we talked about this when we talked about like the trachea and esophagus, the difference, right? That little flap here, and how like we only allow air to come through this and food to come down this. We talked about this, right? And that little flap again is called the epiglottis, and it covers your trachea when you swallow and makes sure food does not get into the esophagus, gets into the esophagus, not the windpipe, which is over here. And so it prevents choking, which is not good. And so after you got a little ball of food and it goes down your esophagus, there's something called peristalsis. And this term actually is actually referring to a movement. So it's kind of hard to explain, but you can kind of see in this graph. It's sort of movement that pushes its along. It's kind of like this wavy form. It's also the movement that worms use to move around as well. And so you can see it contracts, it relaxes, it contracts, relaxes, and it pushes the food down. And where does it push the food down? To the stomach. So in the stomach, there are a bunch of interesting things that happen. Surprisingly, you guys might think the stomach is where most of the digestion happens and the breakdown of material, and that is false. Although a significant portion of food is digested in the stomach, the majority is actually happens in the small intestine, which we'll talk about later. But the stomach's main job actually is act as storage, right? Because the small intestine is small, right? It's a small intestine. It can't fit that much food. So we have this thing called the pyloric sphincter, and this kind of like controls. It's near the area called the pylonus, actually, and it controls like how much food is released. So it releases food at like a steady pace that the small intestine can handle. Some other major roles of the stomach is it stores food, like we talked about, and mixes it with gastric juices, and helps with digestion. So this gastric juice uses acids and enzymes to break down proteins, and also to kill bacteria, which is very important because we don't want bacteria to be absorbed in our body, obviously. It also turns food into a thick liquid called chyme. So it's like chyme is the food mixed with this liquid, and it slowly releases the chyme and food mixture into the small intestine, like we talked about. So this is where it gets really interesting, and this is, I think, one of the coolest things about our body. In the walls of your stomach, you have this sort of wall here, and this wall is very, very interesting. So this is what we call the mucosa, and this is the most outer layer lining of your stomach. So your stomach lining, and then down here doesn't matter too much, just some blood vessels, some muscle layers, etc. But what we're interested in is this area. And here we see these miniature pores in the walls of your stomach, and they lead down to something we call gastric pits and gastric glands. This is where it gets really interesting and where all the magic happens. So if we zoom into a gastric pit, this is what it looks like. It has a bunch of different cells, and I'll talk about their functions briefly. First, we have the surface mucus cell. So they are kind of these white things over here, and they mainly line the outside. And what these cells do is they secrete mucus. And like we talked about, your stomach holds these acidic juices, right? And they help break down the nutrients. But the problem is these acidic juices are actually harmful to your body's own cells. So you have these mucus cells that help protect your stomach. They secrete mucus that lines the other cells, and it protects your stomach from getting digested by itself, if you could say. Next, we have our mucous neck cell. This is essentially the same thing as this one, except it's just in a different area, so it's called a bit different. And then we have the parental cell, and this cell secretes what we call hydrochloric acid and the intrinsic factor. The intrinsic factor is something not related to digestion. It's related to more of the immune system, like we talked about, gets rid of bacteria. So that's more related to the immune system, which we won't talk about too much. We might mention it next class, but the hydrochloric parental cell is pretty interesting. So it secretes this hydrochloric acid, and this is what makes those stomach juices acid. It helps you with your digestion. Next, we have our chief cell, and this secretes hepatosogen and gastric lipase. So the hydrochloric acid makes the stomach juice acidic. The pepiosogen and the gastric lipase help digest the thing. So it's kind of hard to explain, but making the solution more acidic helps these enzymes actually do the digestion. Because if it's just an acidic solution, it's not very helpful with digestion, right? You have to have these enzymes that actually help break down the different molecules in your stomach. Last but not least, we have the G cell, and this secretes a hormone gastrin. And this G cell is mainly for the purposes of stimulating these chief cells and parental cells. And so we can really see this very interesting structure that we have here. Next, we go to number 4, and this is where we get to the absorption of things. So this is where the nutrients get absorbed into the bloodstream. And this is also where enzymes and bile, which is released by your other organs, help break down the food so it could get absorbed. And over here, oh, by the way, this is the small intestine. And the small intestine is also lined with a bunch of villi to increase surface area. So I'll show you what that looks like. And the small intestine has 3 major parts: the duodenum, the genuum, and the ileum. Sorry if I pronounced them wrong. They're very weird names. I don't know why they named it that, but you could just tell it kind of split into 3 different parts. The first part is what we call the duodenum, and this is where most of the secretion happens. And so this is the first part of the small intestine. Essentially, what happens here is sorry. Okay. It receives chyme from the stomach. So remember, the chyme is the mixture of food and the gastric acids, and it begins chemical digestion of fats, proteins, and carbs. So essentially, this duodenum prepares the food for the further absorption in the other areas. And so this is a great visual that helps you visualize where the kind of organs are that donate these enzymes into the small intestine. So here we have the stomach. Here we have the duodenum, a part of the small intestine. And here we have the 3 major organs, you could say. The first is our liver. So liver is connected through these green things. And these are just vessels that help carry enzymes into here. You can see it releases into here. The liver releases some enzymes, and then back here in the pancreas, which also has vessels, and they release some different enzymes. And then here we have the gallbladder, which also releases some different enzymes. The gallbladder actually doesn't specifically produce the enzymes. The gallbladder acts more as a storage for enzymes. but the liver and the pancreas produce the enzymes. So now we get to what molecules are actually released. So from the liver, via the gallbladder, so the liver brings its enzymes, it stores in the gallbladder. What is released? So what is released from the gallbladder is bile. It's not an enzyme, but it is still super important. It does something called emulsifies fats, and this essentially breaks large fat droplets into smaller ones to increase surface area for digestion. Next, what is released from the pancreas? And that is amylase. So amylase is an enzyme, and it helps break down starches, your carbohydrates, into simple sugars like glucose. This is very important. Every time you eat a piece of bread, a hamburger, a banana, etc., what's the main thing that you're taking in? You're obviously taking in like your nutrients, like calcium, potassium, sodium, whatever you need, right? But the main thing you're actually taking in is carbohydrates. That is your glucose, right? Those simple sugars. And if you guys can recall, glucose is what helps power our cells through making ATP. And so this is very important. And those carbohydrates are actually called carbs or calories. So next time you see your nutrition label, the carbohydrates or the calorie level is actually your carbohydrates or your glucose. And so the calories, just briefly, why people get so obsessed with calories. Honestly, it's not that big of a deal. I don't think you should be too obsessed with the calories. You should be definitely more obsessed with things like sodium. Like I said, ions are good for like your nerves function or whatever you want to power your brain, but you want to have balance. Remember that I talked about like the membrane potential of the neurons in the brain. You want to have balance. You don't want to have like bad balance between those different membranes, right? You don't want to have too much potassium or too much chloride or too much sodium. And especially nowadays, um, us humans, we eat a lot more sodium. If you guys look at your any sort of food, your chips, whatever, there's a lot of sodium in there, especially your instant ramen noodles. You guys ever ate those? There's a lot of sodium in that. So yeah. And so, although I'm getting a bit off topic, but although you need all those different nutrients, the main thing that you're eating are those calories, those carbohydrates. And the reason why you hear people say like, don't eat too much carbs, you're gonna get fat. That's because when your body has excess carbohydrates, your liver turns them into glycogen, and then it sends it off to fat cells to store that extra carbohydrate, right? Because you don't need that much carbohydrate. So if you eat too much carbohydrate, it just gets stored in cells. And if your body can't contain all that, well, then it's just they create new cells, which contributes to your fat, right? To store those carbohydrates. It also releases something called lipase. So this is the pancreas. The pancreas releases a whole lord of enzymes, a whole lot of different enzymes. And something that you might have noticed was the liver was actually bigger than the pancreas. And you guys might be asking, well, why does the pancreas release so much and the liver doesn't release that much, even though it's bigger? Well, mainly because the liver's main function is really not to release bile. One of its functions is release bile via the gallbladder, but the liver's main functions, like we talked about, are much different. It's involved in the immune system. It's involved in the glycogen glucose kind of converting to glycogen, converting to glucose. It's what releases insulin, like we talked about. It's what releases a bunch of other different things. It helps circulate the blood, etc. And so the liver is not really, its major role is not to release these enzymes, but the pancreas is. And so back to lipase. Lipase helps break down fats into fatty acids and glycogen. And so I don't have a visual to show you this. I think I might talk about it a bit later, but essentially, remember your remember how you had triglycerides? So here, can you still see this? Yeah, you can see this here. Remember how you have these triglycerides? Um, so essentially what this lipase does is it breaks down these triglycerides the into the fatty acids, which are these things at the front. and the glycerol. Oh, sorry, the fatty acids, which are things at the back, and the glycerol, which are the things at the front, right? And so what it's doing is it's splitting it like kind of here, so we get these two sections, and I'll tell you why that's important later on. But essentially, it's just breaking down, right? Because we wanted to break it down as part of digestion. All right. Next, we have trypsin and chymotrypsin, just kind of two variants. And essentially what it does is it helps break down proteins into smaller peptides. So like we talked about, we have our proteins, which are those large chain of amino acids, right? And so what trypsin does is it breaks down these amino acids or these proteins into individual amino acids. And so I think we'll talk about more bonds in the future, but I think we talked about something called hydrolysis, which is the like bonding of amino acids. But essentially, the reverse is breaking it apart, and that's what this trypsin does, right? Because um, say that we eat a piece of steak, for example, we get that protein, right? We get that piece of protein. Well, steak is from cows, right? Cows use different proteins than humans, right? And so what we want to do is we need that to be useful, right? If we just get a bunch of different cow proteins, that's not going to do anything, right? Because we don't use the same proteins as cows. That wouldn't be very helpful. So what the body does is it uses trypsin and it breaks down the proteins into back to its original building blocks. And so what this does is once it breaks it down to these original building blocks, then the body can build it up to actual protein that it needs. Next, we have nucleases, and this just digests this DNA and RNA into nucleotides. Kind of the same logic with these proteins. And everything you eat has this DNA, RNA, because remember, everything you eat, you're technically just eating cells, right? And cells have DNA inside of them. Um, Unless you eat like, I guess if you eat, I don't know if you guys ate it, like duck blood or something. Um, I think I've tried it once back in China, duck blood. I guess if you're eating that, you're not really digesting any DNA because like we talked about, red blood cells don't have any DNA. But I don't know. That's a pretty interesting question that I might have to research about. Next we have bicarbonate. This is not an enzyme. It just helps neutralize the stomach acid. And so this is bicarbonate. And as you can see, it breaks down into hydrogen atoms and it breaks down into OH atoms. And this just helps neutralize the acid, right? And so this is kind of a detailed look at the small intestine, what a tube looks like. So here we have the tube. Inside the tube, we zoom in, we have this thing called, these are individual cells. And we have a bunch of these different tubes, which we'll look at. And then we have them branching off to what we call villi. So these are villi, and these are cells, epithelial cells. These villi, they, as you can see, this sort of like structure really helps like add surface area to the small intestine, right? And so a bunch of these tubes inside of here, like the blue, red, and green ones, those we'll talk about, those help with absorption, right? So when the food comes through these epithelial cells shown here, it actually goes into these tubes or these vessel tubes that gets distributed throughout the body. Over here is absorption. So after all the breakdown happens, it needs to get absorbed into the body, right? And so there's two main pathways for absorption. First, we have glucose and our amino acids. These directly pass the epithelial cell into the bloodstream. Here we have the villus capillary. So this is the capillary, this is the veins. These pass directly to the capillaries. Something we haven't touched upon, something that's not very known, is what we call the lymph system. And that's this green tube. It's called the lacteal. And this lymph system is another sort of system that is similar to the blood system, but it's not. This is very less, not really talked about. But it's a very interesting part of your body. I highly, highly suggest you do some research on the lymph system. Put that in the chat. The lymph system, highly suggest you do some research on that. It's pretty interesting. It's involved in a lot of your immune responses. And essentially, like we talked about, those enzymes break triglycerides into glycerol and fatty acids. And this is a very key step because triglycerides are actually too big to fit through the epithelial cells. So what happens is it breaks it apart and moves it into the epithelial cell. The cell puts it back together and transports it into the lacteal, into this green tube here. And yeah, this is the lymphatic system. Um, as you can see, it's this green stuff over here. It kind of looks like your blood system, but it's not. It's very interesting. The major role is it protects your body. So a lot of your body fluid constantly gets filtered into the lymphatic system, and it flows through these nodes here. And these nodes have millions upon millions of your immune cells, and we'll talk about your immune system in the next class. And the fluid kind of flows through this, and if the immune system detects any different bacteria or etc., it will destroy it. And the reason why you kind of really get to appreciate why your body cares about these little like viruses and bacteria a lot, they have all these different complex systems to fight it off. It's because it's been like haunting humans for centuries, right? You've seen COVID-19, you've seen a bunch of all these different kind of pandemics. The major threat to human right now, especially right now, and human populations far back when it just started, back to the old civilizations, the major threat to them was always these diseases, always these viruses. It was never tigers, it was never wolves, it was never a cancer. It was always these little like kind of diseases that were here, right? And so some other interesting things is it maintains your fluid level. So like we mentioned, it absorbs a bunch of your fluid, it filters it, and it also controls your food level. And it also absorbs the dietary fat, like we talked about. It absorbs this dietary fat, right? Finally, we'll move on to the large intestine. I'm not sure if this slide is supposed to be here, but we move on to the large intestine. So what the large intestine does is it absorbs water from undigested food. So it absorbs water. The small intestine actually doesn't absorb water. The large intestine is where water absorption occurs. Uh, as it absorbs water, it forms what we call feces and it stores it. It also absorbs some vitamins like vitamin K, vitamin B, vitamin D, vitamin A. And it also houses gut bacteria to help with digestion and immune function. So we actually have a mutualistic symbiotic relationship. So both organisms benefit with bacteria in our stomach. They help us with digestion and our immune function. And essentially, this is what your large intestine looks like. It comes through here, and then your waste gets stored here, and it gets expelled. We also have something called the appendix, and you guys might have heard maybe one of your close friends. I actually had a close friend who had to get surgery to get his appendix out because something happened to it. I'm not sure, but it's fine because the appendix is actually useless. Um, because because everything came from an evolutionary perspective, everything came from one organism to the next. Us humans, we were evolved from an organism that had the appendix, right? But we eventually figured out that we didn't really need the appendix. So over time, the appendix got smaller and smaller within us because there's no point of wasting material to grow the appendix. And we'll talk about how evolution works in future classes. And so this part is kind of useless for us, but it's very useful for other organisms, like we'll talk about. Here we have our large intestine, a sort of more detailed visual approach. It has something similar to the stomach, but these are more related to absorption either rather than excretion, right? And so our gut bacteria, just a bit more into our gut bacteria. So this is kind of the microbiome of the human body. So first we have what we call bacteroids, and these break down fiber slash immune training. We don't have a lot of these. We don't eat a lot of fiber-related material. Other animals do. And we'll talk about what they are and what is fiber and all that. Next, we have lactobacillus. So this makes lactic acid and it fights bad bacteria. We have bifidobacterium, and this helps digestion and lowers inflammation. And we have E. coli. You guys might have heard a bunch of bad stories about E. coli. There's many versions of E. coli, and the one living within us is the good version, which is very good. And it makes vitamin K, and it's just part of the normal gut flora, which is the fancier term of gut microbiotic. And so here we actually get to visualize, really get to appreciate the difference between our digestive system vs a rabbit's digestive system. So our digestive system we can see is kind of like this, like we talked about. But the rabbit's digestive system is much, much, much longer. And the reason for that is because think about what we eat versus what rabbits eat. We eat meats, we eat lettuce, we eat whatever we eat, right? And everything we eat is like sort of processed already, and we have good chewing mechanisms, and we don't eat a lot of raw plants. Anything we eat usually is cooked, right? Or we eat fruits, etc. And so it's pretty not that hard to absorb. But what rabbits eat is things like grass, a bunch of different other plants, right? And it only feeds on that. And what and that presents it a problem because plants, remember their cell walls, are made of something called cellulose. And cellulose is a very strong starch because plants need to be strong, right? And so the problem with rabbits is they eat too much of this plant and they need a way to efficiently digest that cellulose. And so that's why they have a much longer digestive system for longer, like kind of a longer track for it to get broken down. Another big difference is a difference in the cecum, which is also your appendix. Basically, your appendix. Cecum and appendix are interchangeably used. And so we can see our cecum is basically like small. It's barely there. It's useless as well. And the cecum of rabbits is very, very long. Why? Because rabbits house those, let me go back to the slide. Rabbits house those bacteroids. Rabbits house a bunch of bacteroids in their cecum to help digest that cellulose, like we talked about. And that's the end of this presentation. Thank you guys for listening. Hope you guys learned something from that. Next class, we will be talking about the immune system. I do have a look at plan. I guess we could play for a bit. And then, yeah. We could play for a bit, and let's see. Okay. Do you guys have any game mode you wanna see, or I can just pick one? I'll give you like 1 minute if you guys have any specific game modes that you guys wanna see. Let's see. We could play. Oh, Egg Hunt. Oh yeah, I think this is new. We could try Egg Hunt. Yeah, we can try Egg Hunt. Here's the code. I'll be give it a 1 or 2 minutes. I don't know if you guys want to play Book It. If you don't want to play Book It, I don't really have anything else prepared for you. If you don't want to play, just feel free to leave now. I guess we could end class a bit earlier. Next class we'll be talking about the immune system, which is pretty interesting, I think. It's how your body fights for you, and it does fight for you basically 24/7. So that should be pretty interesting. All right, I don't think anyone wants to play. Um, well then, I guess that's it for this class. We'll end it a bit earlier because I literally don't have anything else prepared. Next class, like we talked about, the immune system. And then after that, we're going to be moving on to, we're actually moving on to a whole new different topic. And this month of April, we talked all about anatomy and physiology. So next we'll move on to uh, in May, we're going to be talking about evolution, biodiversity, and ecology. So things like evolution and natural selection, which is super interesting. The importance of the biodiversity. You guys might think the topic of biodiversity is kind of boring, but I assure you it is very interesting and I'll make it interesting. We'll talk about ecology and ecosystem, so food webs, food chains, and how all that works. Well, and we're going to talk about adaptations in nature, so sort of case study on the last day. And then in June, we're going to have, and then after May is June, and then June's pretty much nearing the end of our class. We're going to be launching a kind of research project and yeah, and we'll be recovering all the, we're gonna reviewing all the topics, etc. Yeah, and so that's it of today. I'll see you guys next week.